Elite Facts presents
5 more of the world's greatest unsolved mysteries.
5.
Why is the Titanic still underwater? Now, this one does have some reasoning to it, but we'll get to that shortly. Has it ever occurred to anyone as to why there hasn't been any expedition to retrieve the remains of the once proclaimed unsinkable ship? Yes, doing this now is most definitely pointless, as trying to retrieve any parts of this ship would result in those parts deteriorating by simply touching them. So doing it now is completely pointless, but why wasn't it done during the 80 or 90 years after the ship sunk? Think about it. We were able to retrieve the Mary Rose from the ocean's depths back in the 1970s. Granted, we were only able to retrieve a portion of the ship during the excavation process, but the ship had been submerged for around 300 years. So what was the excuse when it came to the Titanic? Well, here's the thing. There's been attempts to recover some of the wreckage of the Titanic. In fact, one of these attempts happened only a few days after the Unsinkable initially sank. So what went wrong? Well, for starters, in response to that first attempt to recover some of the wreckage, they simply didn't have the right technology to recover around 52,310 tons. So that alone is pretty understandable. This is why they decided to just wait it out until the technology became available to them, and even then that wouldn't be until the later years of the 20th century. But here's where problem number 2 arises. Nobody knew exactly where the Titanic sank. The reason for this confusion is that the wreckage of the ship was initially discovered 15 miles away from where the initial distress signals were being broadcasted from. Luckily, the wreckage of the Titanic was eventually discovered by complete accident in 1985. It was discovered during an expedition conducted in the Atlantic Ocean to test out 2 nuclear submarines, and they just so happened to come across the remains of the Titanic itself. They noted that each half of the Titanic lied around half-mile apart from each other, and despite the bow section of the Titanic being in fairly good condition, the rest of the ship looked pretty much unsalvageable. So if the bow was in good condition, why wasn't it recovered? We certainly had the technology at that point, so what gives? Well, the reasoning behind why parts of the Titanic weren't recovered in the later years of the 20th century is because the wreckage lies around 2.3 miles underwater. Now, that doesn't sound too bad when you take into consideration that the temperature that low would be Baltic and that the pressure going down that low would be way too high to comprehend. It does make sense as to why it hasn't been recovered. Still, though, considering it was done for the Mary Rose, as well as other various ships, it does beg the question as to why there hasn't been any modest attempts in the later years of the 20th century. But hey, if you're rich, you can still see the legendary ship for yourself in 2019 when they open up a submarine ride to the public, so people can view it for themselves. But only if you've got $100,000 to burn. 4. Bigfoot. Either that's one big hairy dude or it's just the real deal. Everyone knows the legend of Bigfoot, also known by its other name, Sasquatch. Bigfoot is supposedly a creature that lives in the snowy mountainous regions of the United States and Canada. The reason we say supposedly is due to how little evidence there is in regards to this creature's existence. That being said, however, the evidence that does exist is a very, very strong implication when it comes to its existence. Unlike the Loch Ness Monster, which we'll get into later in this video, the infamous photo of Bigfoot is not only incredibly clear, unlike the previously mentioned Loch Ness evidence, but there's not been much evidence to prove that the photo is a fake. Yes, it could have been a tall person who dressed up as a Wookiee one day and had his friend take a photo of him. Maybe it was Andre the Giant on a day when he didn't shave. Who knows? All we know, though, is that if this image is a hoax, the person who did the makeup for Bigfoot deserves an award.
3.
Amelia Earhart. This may be one of the biggest mysteries to come out of the 20th century. Famously known as the first ever American female aviator, Amelia Earhart was even more well known for her journey across the entirety of the Atlantic Ocean, all by herself. And as if that wasn't an impressive enough accomplishment, Earhart has also set many other records, such as being the first person to fly from the Red Sea to India, first person to fly solo from Los Angeles to Mexico City in around 13 and a half hours, and was also the first woman to fly solo non-stop coast to coast. Set women's non-stop transcontinental speed record, flying 2,447.8 miles in just a little over 19 hours. Needless to say, she was a woman of firsts, and it's easy to see why she was a great influence to all women of the era. Hell, still a great influence by today's standards. But in 1937, while flying over the Central Pacific Ocean near Howland Island, Earhart's aircraft mysteriously disappeared. The reason for her sudden disappearance is still unknown despite all the search efforts. There's been more findings, however, but everything as of right now, despite these findings such as distress calls and what could potentially be her bones, are still up for debate. That being said, however, keep an eye out as more findings are sure to surface sooner rather than later thanks to these findings.
2.
Loch Ness Monster. Much like Bigfoot, how could we not mention the legend of the Loch Ness Monster? It's a staple of Scottish folklore. Now, obviously, despite most of the images taken of the monster being outed as a hoax, there's still several pictures that are up for debate as to whether or not they're legit. So for those of you who are unaware of the legend, which is highly unlikely, but we'll still go over it to clear things up, the Loch Ness Monster, or more well known in its homeland as Nessie, is an aquatic creature found in Scotland in the 1930s. Many believers and theorists suggest that the Loch Ness Monster is a very large animal that represents a line of dinosaurs that were once thought to be extinct. The breed is unknown, however, due to its appearance, it's believed to be something along the lines of a stegosaurus. The surgeon's photograph, which dates back to 1934, is believed to be the first photographic evidence of the creature. While many people wrote this image off as a hoax, no physical or visual evidence has been provided for either side of the argument.
1.
Who was Jack the Ripper? We won't go into too much detail given the circumstances as to why the man lived in infamy back in the Victorian era. So back in 1888 alone, an unknown individual who was appropriately given the name Jack the Ripper took the lives of at least 5 women in London. Needless to say, his crimes were downright sick in terms of what he actually did. But considering how many victims fell to the Ripper, it's crazy to think that they didn't really have any concrete evidence as to who the Ripper was. All they had were a number of different letters that were sent to law enforcement that were supposedly from the Ripper himself. Whether any of them were actually written by the Ripper is a matter of debate among scholars. The name Jack the Ripper isn't just a cute newspaper headline. The name, in fact, comes from these letters supposedly sent by the Ripper himself. Needless to say, the Ripper was never found, and over the years, dozens of people have been brought up as possible candidates. A recent discovery from old documentation, however, lists a woman by the name of Lizzie Williams as the Ripper. However, this is a debate amongst many historians as to whether she was the Ripper or not. As time moves forward, though, it seems more and more unlikely that we'll ever know the true identity of one of the most wicked of the Victorian era. And that's our list. Did we leave any out that you know about? Let us know in the comments section below. Please remember to subscribe and tap the bell button so we can notify you when new videos are uploaded. Thanks for watching.
Don't forget to like us and subscribe for more elite facts.